Need a cup of joe in the morning? Why not give Squirrely Joe's a try? Squirrely Joe's is owned and operated by the Morris family, who believe in all of Christ for all of life. Visit them today at squirrelyjoes.com. That's squirrelyjoes.com.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm Josh Howard, and today I'm joined by CR Wiley. So, Mr. Wiley, thank you so much for joining us here on Eschatology Matters.
Great to be with you, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
So many of our viewers are probably familiar with your work. I came across you as an author, but would you mind, for those who are not familiar with your writing and with your ministry, you wear a few different hats. So could you give us just a brief word of bio?
Sure. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, right? I live in Battleground, Washington, which is like the coolest name for a town in America. Battle Creek might be a close second.
I was about to say, yeah, we're up for a tie there.
But anyway, I've done a number of things. I've been a pastor since the late 1980s, but I've also been a contractor and a professor of philosophy. I taught philosophy for about a decade to undergraduates in the Boston area. I was involved in urban ministry during those years too, so I was involved in all kinds of stuff in the city of Boston. And anyway, I've been a real estate investor. I've been an investor since the early 90s. I think I bought my first property in 1994. And so I've been involved in that, and I'm a writer and an illustrator. I do both, but mostly I'm known for my writing, and written a few books.
Okay, yeah, and you are into, you mentioned the illustration, but you're into art. I've recently discovered.
Yeah,
quite the art fan.
Well, I collect, and I come from a family of artists. I've got both my wife and I, our families are both kind of deeply rooted in academic interest, but also the arts. So, we both have extended family that, hang out in places like Nashville and LA, stuff like that. I could tell you stuff and point you to stuff, and you wouldn't believe these people are related to us.
Very cool. No, that's such an interesting background. So let's jump in, because obviously we're going to gear this toward eschatology at some point. We will manhandle this conversation towards some eschatological themes, but in general, I think a lot of the stuff you've touched on in your writing, and even the things you post, you host or co-host, I suppose, the podcast, and a lot of things you guys touch on, although they may not be eschatology in the way that many people might think of them. They're dealing with those kind of, worldview, teleological type discussions, right? Like they're eschatological in nature. But you wrote a book, and this was described with an eschatological theme. I saw I can't remember if it was on the inside of the book or if it was on one of the reviews, but it described it as the eschatological centrality of the household. And that book was The Household and the War for the Cosmos: Recovering a Christian Vision for the Family. Which, if anybody has not picked that up, such a good book. That's, what is it, 4 years old now, maybe?
Yeah, it's about right. It's based on an address I gave in Chicago at the Touchstone Conference, and it was a really fabulous event. And but anyway, that served as the basis for the book.
Okay, I listened to it on audiobook. And, it's always a coin toss with audiobook versus physical book. This is one I would recommend a physical book, because I had to keep pausing the audiobook. And, sometimes you're making notes and stuff. This was not a good one for audiobook for me. I would have rather had one sitting in my hand that first go around. But it's a very pertinent topic. And I'm going to let you lead into a little bit of that and just kind of recap for those who aren't familiar with it. But it's very pertinent. Nancy Pearcey, she is releasing a book. In fact, I think it just released maybe this week, or it's releasing next week, on a very similar theme. And I was talking with her on a different production, and I happened to mention, I said, yeah, this sounds a lot like one that CR Wiley wrote back in the day, and I'd forgotten she wrote the foreword for that one.
That's right, right. So she was there at the conference. She was one of the other speakers.
Perfect. Yeah. So very, very still timely in as far as the theme and everything goes. But what would you mind just giving us a little bit of a recap on that, what the book was addressing? Because for me, this was one of those, I don't know, sometimes you've read things and you're familiar with some of the underlying themes, and yet when somebody puts it together and kind of presents it in this compelling format, it's just kind of one of those things where your brain clicks. That's what this book did for me as far as the family goes. But for those who aren't familiar, would you mind?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think It's kind of to provide, again, context for the conference. The topic for the conference was patriarchy, believe it or not.
Okay.
So we were all talking about the subject of, the rule of fathers. And what I think is often obscured or lost in our contemporary setting is what a household was understood to be in the first century.
Mm.
And this was something that everybody was on the same page about. Seneca and the Apostle Paul, they both understood it in the same way. And that's what's been lost. So like today, when people use the term family, they just mean a kind of a group of people who like each other a lot, maybe even love each other and live in the same house. And that's about it,
Right.
It gets more and more kind of watered down as time goes by. But in antiquity, and really up until the Industrial Revolution, it was understood to be a going concern, an economic production center, a center of productive activity might be a good way to put it. And the word economy actually is a compound word in the Greek, oikos, nomos. So that's where the term comes from. And it means the law of the house. And the reason you needed a law of the house is because everybody depended upon the cooperative work that was performed in a household in order to survive. So a father wasn't just some kind of crazed dictator who just enjoyed pushing people around. A father was somebody who oversaw the work of a house and made sure that everybody got what they deserved, meaning the good and the bad. In other words, rewards and punishments and stuff like that, adjudicating disputes, keeping everybody on task, those sorts of things.
Mm. Okay.
So that was the framework. Now, there were everybody also understood in antiquity that this small order was a kind of fractal in character, in the sense that it reflected a larger order. The larger order was the cosmos. So the word cosmos in Greek meant order at the largest level. And today we use it to mean outer space, right?
Right.
Like cosmos with like Carl Sagan or what's his face.
Right.
But anyway, but in antiquity, and we translate the word into the English word world, which is a bit unfortunate because people in our time just think of world as like a place rather than an order. But in the first century, everybody understood that it was an order and that there was a war for the cosmos, in the sense that there were dark forces that were subverting the rule of the creator. Now, obviously, people who were Roman and pagan didn't think of the God of the Bible as the one who created the order. They thought of, the pantheon of the gods and so
Right.
forth, Jupiter and so forth. But they still believed there was an order and that it was governed by the gods. So the war was a war to disrupt the order, but there was also another kind of war, and that was a war related to who's really on top. And this is where pagans and Christians were, at odds with each other. So the resurrection of Christ was a statement. It was a declaration that Christ is on top. He is risen from the dead and is ascended to the right hand of the Father and governs the cosmos.
Mm.
This was news to the Romans because they believed that Caesar sat in that spot. He was the son of the gods and was divine. And so the Christian claim that Jesus is Lord was not simply, he's Lord of my heart or, Lord of my personal affairs or anything like that. It was a declaration that he is the Lord of all things and that all things will bow to him. And if you're not bowing to him, you will, whether you want to or not. And that was the declaration.
Yeah, man, that's so huge. And one of the things that I think was so helpful about this book, particularly for Christians, is that for many of us, there's been I don't know, within my lifetime, it seems like there is a current retrieval maybe of the emphasis of the family and something beyond just the fact that families are good, but that families are foundational, not just for society, but as you're kind of sussing out there, an eschatological or cosmological centrality of the family. Like it's about something much more than that. And that seems to run so counter to the things in our society where, I have friends in public education, for example. Some of the Christians still fighting the good fight in the public education sphere, and to even suggest that we can look to the family, or specifically to fatherhood, as you brought up, as kind of definitional for some of these societal problems that we have. That's verboten as far as our current culture seems to be handling those things. But you're pushing back and saying kind of the opposite of that.
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons that's occurred. I think most obvious reasons have to do with the fact that we don't want God to govern our lives. We'd rather just govern our own lives by our own, guided by our own desires and so forth. But at another level, there have been some important institutional shifts in society that have given people kind of the impression that the household is not central, that there are other institutions that have supplanted it or replaced it. And many of the crazy things we see around us have to do with that. Unfortunately, Christians over the last, say, 30, 40 years in the United States, or in the West in general, have unwittingly kind of played into this. You think about a person like James Dobson, is praiseworthy as he was. His approach was to kind of take the psychological frame of reference with regard to families and so forth, and understand the household as strictly kind of an environment in which healthy relationships were in place that helped form the healthy psychological and even, I guess, maybe aspirational character of children. So that's, it's fine. But that's part of the picture, but not the whole picture. So he didn't have a way of thinking about things that placed all of that within the framework of, the productive household, or how the household relates to the larger picture, meaning the kingdom and what the world we're looking to inhabit someday, the new the new heaven, the new earth, and so forth. Right. So what we have in the family is a picture of the end of the world, and that's described for us in Ephesians, particularly in chapter 5.
Yeah, and that's kind of where that's where my mind went when you described it as. And again, I should have looked. I don't know if this is on the actual dust jacket or if this is a description of the book, but the eschatological centrality of the household, which is at least a theme, if it's not verbatim from the book. But thinking of that eschatological, because for many people, we wouldn't attach those two things together, right? Household and eschatology. For many Christians, eschatology, as we've talked about in the show many times, but that becomes something truncated. That's the final chapter of the book. That's not the entirety of the book. So we've pushed back a great deal on that and said, no, eschatology is instead this whole warp and woof of the story. And the household then is kind of at the center of that. One of the things your book really exposed, especially in my mind, because again, it's like the puzzle pieces are there, but I hadn't connected them, was how much of this is recent. You trace a lot of this post-industrial revolution, but like these are recent things where for many, not that things were perfect beforehand, but you saw many of the things that were clicking. A lot of the gears were synced up, whereas now the gears are on separate tables, and we're trying to figure this out as Christians.
Yeah. It's been kind of disassembled. If you've ever come across, like, say, maybe something that was complicated but was disassembled by somebody, and they failed to put it back together again. Yeah, you're right. That's kind of where we are. We're with this box of parts. Right. We're not sure how it all fits together. But modernity disassembled things. It's sort of the premise that informed the modern outlook is that the world that we live in is just a machine, and then we can disassemble it and reassemble it in ways that we would like to see it work, and that we won't be harmed in the process. But we're seeing lots of ways that we are,
right?
And that we're made for certain things, and that the world has a kind of inner logic. And when I talk about these matters, doesn't take long for people to kind of get it. And I think it's because we all kind of see, oh, of course, that's the way it worked forever.
Mm.
Our ancestors weren't idiots. Our ancestors were actually a lot smarter than we are in many respects, and we need to recover their wisdom. So yeah. And now, with regard to the end of the story, it's all there in the New Testament. When Christ refers to himself as the groom and the church is referred to as the bride, well, you need a man and a woman, right, to
Mm-hmm.
make that even make sense, and they need to be joined in matrimony, right? And so there's the great wedding feast of the Lamb. It's not just about the feast, but it's about the wedding. And what you have in Ephesians 5 is Paul addressing the subject of households in this world and how they work, and how that is a reflection of the eschatological household and how it works. So Paul's argument is essentially, husbands behave in this way because this is how Christ relates to the church. Wives behave in this way because this is how the church relates to Christ. That's the argument, and it's a picture of the end of the world.
Wow. So I wonder, in your experience, you've done some speaking on this. You mentioned, speaking at a conference with patriarchy as one of the themes. So that was ahead of the curve, right, as far as that's concerned. But thinking about a lot of the at least popular level retrieval of some of these things that seems to be going on right now. There seems to be a lot of Christians that are trying to grapple with how to lead their homes well, how to think 3, 4, 5 generations down the road, how to retrieve a hopeful eschatology in some form or fashion. Do you see this concept of the house coming out in this kind of popular level eschatology? Do you see these two things meeting? Is the one producing the other in essence, or what's your take on that as far as Christians trying to work through these doctrines?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't invent any of this. This is all stuff that I just saw.
Right.
So I'm not surprised at all that people are recovering it. I don't take any credit for it. I'm just one more person who's doing this work.
For sure.
And I think, I think there are a lot of encouraging things going on. A lot due to the fact that more and more we're seeing that the contemporary world's in trouble in many respects. We've known that for a long time, but I think it's becoming more kind of clear just how the world's in trouble. And I think, too, there's been a kind of conventional wisdom shared by lots of Christians across denominational lines that has proven to be not so wise. And people are disillusioned with things and are saying, the stuff that was developed in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s that was supposed to win the world for Christ has actually won the church for the world in many respects. And so we need to kind of go back to basics and say, okay, what are we missing here? So I think that's a lot of what is occurring. And I think the household, and particularly as it relates to the church, is of interest to lots of folks because the household is so clearly under attack and has been for a long time. But some things have developed in the last, I would say, decade that people just 20, 30 years ago couldn't conceive of. They would, if you would have brought it up. In fact, I did back in the day. I lived in Cambridge. I went to Harvard Divinity School. I heard and saw all kinds of things. And, when I would say to folks, this is coming, they would say, oh, you're overreacting. You're an alarmist. There's just no way anybody would be that dumb. And I say, no, it's coming. This is one of those things where you're right and wish you weren't. Yeah. So I've been, everything I've been saying for the last 20 plus years is actually coming to pass, but I wish it wasn't the case. I'd be much happy to have been wrong.
For sure. And there's been so many. I mean, obviously the last couple of years have been so, or seem to have been so rapid. I mean, I know that's probably the feeling of every generation, but the last couple of years seem to have really been rapid. But for a lot of Christians seem to have, you hear, and I'm trying to remember the position of this person, but you heard a government official saying that it is our job to raise your children. This is not the job.
Yeah, that was President Biden.
Yeah, well, there you go. I didn't want to be wrong, but I'm glad you had the reference there. But yeah,
Yeah.
hearing those sort of things, I think, has rattled many Christian parents that maybe, like you said, maybe 20 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe even for those of us who haven't been in ministry for 20 years. But I remember 10 years ago trying to emphasize, parents, you're the primary disciple makers of your children. And that kind of clicked. I think it's clicking in a different way now for people,
Yeah.
that they're starting to connect those dots that may not have been as clear maybe a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yep.
No, let me ask you this, because in line with that, one of the things that you brought up in your book, and I really enjoyed this, was number one of the things in that book that was such a beautiful picture was kind of that child, growing up and seeing dad work. You're learning from dad, you're seeing dad interact with mom. There's kind of that pre-industrial revolution type picture. You have a vested interest in the family's business, and that was one of the things that really started clicking for me, was that when the child's working, they're not just working for an employer or something. This is part of their not just their livelihood, but this is part of their inheritance in essence, right? This is the family lineage. And one of the things that I've heard you mention elsewhere is not just helping your children as you were establishing your own home, which I think has been maybe the predominant perspective, at least when I was growing up. That seems to have been one of the Christian emphases, was establish your home. But then you've talked about your responsibility to establish your children's home. In other words, looking generations down the line. Well, could you walk us in a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what you're looking to do is create an intergenerational legacy. So you think about, say, the reference to the patriarchs, or references to the patriarchs in Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a set of connections there. There's an inheritance that's been passed down, and that's what covenant theology is. The framework that covenant theology helps us to see. I think my kids are all grown. I have 3 children. They have households of their own. They all have children of their own. But I'm still, working to help them along. I'm not nosy. I'm not, getting into their affairs or anything like that. But I want to be supportive,
Right.
and I want to do things that are genuinely helpful. I'm also trying to store up value that I can pass on to them in different ways. And so you think about it this way. So like when we think about, say, retirement and how we're going to live in our retirement years, we think about stuff like Social Security or 401k or something like that, or those things. But before those institutions were established, essentially your retirement plan was your kids.
Right.
That's really what. Now, the other thing about the current situation is it's still the case that we depend on younger people. So Social Security, for example, it's not like a bank that you just put money into and it just sits there and waits for you to draw it out. I mean, the money that goes in goes out. So I pay into Social Security like anybody else, and that money is immediately redistributed to people who need it, people who paid in, in the past. And so we owe them because they paid in and took care of other people who were older than them. And now we pay in, and those funds are used to take care of people who are older than us or who are disabled or whatever. That's how the system works. So we still depend on other people. Basically, all the Social Security system is a kind of a fiduciary. It's a means of taking and sort of centralizing this whole process and then keeping it going. And there are some good reasons for that, but it's possible for us to actually think that Social Security is a thing, that the Social Security Administration just is a thing, and it doesn't need anybody to keep it solvent. No, actually, it needs children to keep it solvent, the productive children to keep it solvent. The same thing's true with your 401k. What happens when the markets shrink? What happens when there's a shrinking population? Do values continue to rise? No, of course not. They actually tank. So we've created these institutions to serve as fiduciaries, and they're kind of intermediary in character. But because of our lack of understanding or failure to understand their natures, we can actually think they're real things, and not just simply means by which our children take care of us. So we need kids. We still need kids. We've always needed kids. We need kids. They are not just the future in the sense that they're going to live after we're gone, but they're the future in the sense they're trying to take care of us as we're leaving the world.
Right.
So now I'm not counting on Social Security to be solvent forever. I'm not counting on the market to always be, sort of trending upward. I want to also pass on assets to my kids that will make it easier for them to care for my wife and me. So that's the real estate, that's the art, that's other stuff.
Yeah, no, that's, and it seems that that's in keeping with, thinking toward children. For many, my wife's the oldest of 7, so like within her family tradition, that was very expected. Like, which one of you is going to be the one providing for mom when she gets older, and those type of things. But yeah, for Christian eschatology, it seems that there's been a retrieval of this thinking 3 or 4 generations down the road. And I think maybe in some ways the Christians kind of imbibed a little bit of that spirit of the world, where the world looks around and says, how could we bring children into a place this bad, right? Like things are spiraling. And I think that's kind of an excuse that people give, but let's just take it at face value. I think for many Christians, we started thinking in those terms, and maybe our conception of eschatological imminence began to override any sort of groundwork for the generations down the road. And I'm seeing some of that coming back, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, during the 70s, there was a book entitled The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. It was, that was an odd time. I lived during that time. I remember those years. It was the same time when everybody was talking about, all kinds of things like, chariots of the gods. And, it was just a time where people were like, looking at, the Egyptian pyramids and wondering if aliens had built them. It was a time where people were like really into like wild stuff, and it's some of that's come back, but it was a fruitful time in the sense that everybody was kind of alarmed at the Club of Rome in the late 60s, early 70s was sort of like the situation now where everybody's talking about the end of the world because of ecological collapse or whatever. So this is like my 3rd time through this stuff. And I remember those days. I mean, you have books, he had movies like, Planet of the Apes and Soylent Green and, all that kind of stuff. It's fun to watch Soylent Green today because I think it was like, Soylent Green was about the distant future from the perspective of 1973. It was like the year 2022 or something like that, and there's Charlton Heston in this like city of New York with 50 million people, and people are just eating each other. That's what they really thought was going to happen. And, anyway, it didn't.
Right. Of course, now you can buy Soylent Green on the shelves. That's a common brand.
That's right. Yeah, my son actually worked for Soylent for a little while. It was kind of weird. I was like, you guys know what this actually kind of sounds like to a person like me with, members of the film? Anyway, but so the alarmism, the sort of this notion that everything was collapsing was sort of a broadly held conviction. It wasn't just something that a bunch of premillennialists were talking about. Everybody was thinking that way,
right?
And so it was it was helpful for the cause of evangelism to say, well, Christ is returning any minute. You got to be ready and that kind of thing. And so it led to kind of a mini awakening. There was a kind of a surge of interest. Well, in fact, there was a film that came out not too long ago about those years. What was it called? Something about Jesus something. I can't remember. But I think it was about kind of the Jesus people in California.
Jesus Revolution, maybe?
Yep, Jesus Revolution. That was it. Yeah, that was about those years.
Yeah.
But, now we're in a situation where I think, we've been through this a few cycles. I mean, it happened again in the late 80s. And there's a need, I think, that a lot of people feel to kind of grow up when it comes to this stuff and to say, you know what? It's about time we start building things that last.
Right. No, that's good. Let me ask you a little bit about the podcast. You guys just did a couple of live shows there in Memphis for the podcast. You guys and you have a extensive backlog, 200 something episodes at this point, I believe.
I think we're going on to 300, kind of in that range now. Yeah.
Wow. And I'm not sure how to describe the podcast as far as topics go, because it's wide ranging, right? You guys are touching on philosophy and AI and literature and pretty eclectic as far as the subject matter goes. But let me ask you this, because I know you guys have touched on this recently, and just thinking within eschatological categories, my question is Bitcoin the mark of the beast, and why is your answer yes?
That's a funny one. Yeah. So you probably are referring to the fact that I just spoke at the Bitcoin conference.
Absolutely. I'm interested. I am
Yeah.
interested. And,
Yeah.
and in all honesty, like, I mean, I'm obviously, speaking tongue in cheek, but when people see things like Bitcoin or anything that sounds monolithic or maybe cross national or international in that sense, conceptions come up, right? So, but
Yeah.
what's been your interest and experience with that?
Well, the interest in Bitcoin, there are kind of two ways that I grew interested in it. One was just the notion of sound money, the idea that fiat currency it lends itself to government manipulation, and when that occurs, the people who pay the price tend to be the people who can least afford it.
Yeah.
People on fixed incomes and so forth. I don't think people realize that that's how it works. It's a kind of stealth taxation when the government incurs debt and then prints a lot of money to sort of pay off its bills. Sometimes that's put into the into the language of sort of helping the economy through a rough patch or something like that, making sure the liquidity is available. But when it comes down to it, who are the people who are having a harder time paying for the heat or paying for their groceries? Well, it's grandma,
Mm-hmm.
who's, getting a, $1,500, a month in Social Security, and they never increase the payout at the level or at the rate that the inflation is occurring. So grandma is not able to buy as much as she used to. Other people who are on the edge, people who are just barely squeaking by, they're the ones who suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So that was of interest to me. But the other thing that interested me is the fact that fiat currencies, because they are issued by governments, are subject to the control of governments.
Right.
And they can be used in a way to coerce people. And we saw that with the Canadian truckers, for example. These guys made a bold move to protest what the Canadian government had instituted with regard to COVID restrictions and so forth. And the Canadian government said, okay, we're going to freeze all your bank accounts. Now they can do that because all of the banks depend on the central bank for their own liquidity. I don't think people understand how fiat currencies work and how central banks control everything in this sort of the kind of the ecology or the of the banking system. So those Canadian truckers actually were helped by people who sent them Bitcoin.
Wow.
Now, Bitcoin is something that the Canadian government can't stop. Not even the Chinese Communist Party can stop Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not a fiat currency. It's not a currency that is controlled by a government. It's a completely autonomous currency. It's gold without the problem that comes with gold. So gold is great. I own precious metals, so I'm not trying to imply that they're not valuable. I think they're important. But the problem is that governments confiscate gold.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that in 1933 with the Bank Holiday Act. We saw it we saw it in communist countries. One of the things that communists did in China and in this former Soviet Union is go from house to house and confiscate people's valuables, gold, silver, diamonds, etc., to make everyone completely dependent upon government currencies, the ruble, the yuan, it was the yen. What Bitcoin does is you can't stop it that way. And the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to stop it for years and can't. And it's because it's an electronic currency and it relies upon the internet, which was designed to function in an environment where people are trying to stop it.
Right.
The internet was designed to survive a nuclear attack. That's what the internet was designed for. It's a nuclear attack. So with that in mind, no matter what the Chinese government does, there's a way around it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the most active Bitcoiners in the world are Chinese.
Interesting. I think it's fascinating on as far as Christians go, and churches, we had an elder that had brought up doing Bitcoin here as a tithing option, and honestly, like when I first heard that, I was like, that's a bit silly. And then we saw another church beat us to it, and now I'm thinking, well, that's probably not a bad idea. But no, as far as Christians living in a time in which Western civilization doesn't seem to be trending upward in any sense right now, and many people are discussing, maybe the Benedict option to a certain extent of kind of creating this Christian subculture within a larger culture, and I think there's a little bit of tension there between that and what I would label the Boniface option, just taking the axe to the tree, so to speak. But still, if you're looking to a Christian subculture in any regard, something like Bitcoin makes a lot of sense, that you would need your own currencies, you would need your own way of bartering and trading and doing commerce within a larger culture that's hostile to that Christian subculture.
Yeah, what are you going to do if one day your bank notifies you, Josh, that sermon you preached last Sunday was hate speech? We can't be involved with that. We're going to shut you down. I mean, right now, PayPal, on a whim, can shut you down,
right?
And has shut down people.
Right.
So it's not unprecedented. It's not, alarmism is not crazy stuff. I mean, it's happened. We've seen it. And all you need to do is find yourself, out of step with the prevailing, sort of trends in our society to be labeled, an enemy of the state.
Right. Now, and I think the alarmism is where, and this is going to transition into what I wanted to get to in a second here, but the alarmism, it not being alarmism, I think is really important for Christians, that you can have a hopeful, victorious, eschatological outlook on things and not wear a tinfoil hat. And yet at the same time, as you said, the things you were warning about 20 years ago, now people are, recognizing. It's not tinfoil hat to say, there was a point at which probably 5 years ago, I would have said no U.S. state is going to take your children from you at age 12 and perform surgeries on them. And yet now we're seeing laws passed in that regard. That's not tinfoil hat. That's just, if the winds seem to be blowing this way, let's prepare accordingly for whatever might come.
Yeah, I think it's just prudence.
Right, prudence. Is there, by the way, before I move on though, is there a way? It was the Thank God for Bitcoin conference. Are those available online?
I believe so. Yeah. I think that if you just Google "Thank God for Bitcoin," you'll find the organization. It's actually a business, and it's run by some Christians, and there are a lot of Christians in that world, and a number of people who are into it primarily because it helps them to fund their efforts in restricted, highly closed countries.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good. I want to ask you, because I do want to be respectful of your time today, but I do want to ask you about your pastoral interactions with eschatology, how you've seen eschatology, and specifically a hopeful eschatology, working out in your pastoral ministry within your church. Like I said, I know you wear a lot of different hats, but one of them is as pastor, and how you've seen that within your congregation, and as a lead into that. There's a lot of room for Christians to despair. We were talking about seeing which way the winds are blowing, and maybe just seeing the threats on the horizon, however you want to phrase that. But that can lead to despair for a lot of us. Just today, I was like, well, let me just pull up one example, and the first one on my news feed was Anheuser-Busch accepted the lead marketing award at Cannes. This is Anheuser-Busch that just made an absolute train wreck of everything with their I don't even know how to describe that marketing strategy.
Sure.
But you look at things like that, and there's plenty of room for a Christian to see that and just throw their hands up and say, there's so many lies, and there's so much darkness that seems to be just bubbling up, and so many things that just are contradictory to truth. How have you seen eschatology be a hopeful thing for the Christian, not as burying our heads in the sand, but instead encouraging them within the church? How have you seen eschatology play out within a pastoral role specifically?
I think there are two things that a Christian should be able to affirm. One is that Christ has already won.
Mm-hmm.
So the story is already told. We know how the story ends. At the same time, there's going to be a lot of suffering in the meantime.
Yeah.
So just because things aren't going to, real well for us in the moment doesn't mean the story's over. This is a particular chapter in the larger story. This is an ongoing conflict. That we're going to see kind of the, I guess, kind of the moves in our culture of kind of, 2 steps forward, 1 steps back. Those kinds of things should be expected. It's not just kind of this easy path to victory. I mean, I think Christ was absolutely clear. If they hate me, they'll hate you. You're going to face a lot of opposition. You're not going to be the most popular guy at city council meetings. You're going to this is part of the package, what it means to be a follower of Christ.
Right.
So that's how you do it. And you just keep reminding yourself of the end of the story, of the resurrection, of the kingdom come, those sorts of things on an ongoing basis, and keep at it. So you mentioned the Boniface option and the Benedict option. I think that's a good way to kind of think about it. We actually do both. We build and we attack. Both both of those things should be going on in our work. So in my church, we've got a number of entrepreneurs in the church, very successful ones. We have people who are upbeat and kind of engaged in our local setting, and in different ways, even politically. So there's a lot of really positive stuff, but we're not at all naive about what maybe people will think about us, or
Right.
whatever. We know that going into things.
Right. No, that's good. Yeah, for many Christians, like you said, just keeping the story in front of them, and maybe I can use. I wanted to at least bring up your book on the House of Tom Bombadil. I think it was In the House of Tom Bombadil, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously written about that kind of enigmatic character in Tolkien's work, but still the power of story. I've seen a lot of that with eschatology. It's about telling people not just about what a particular passage means, although that's greatly important, but also just connecting them to that broad story of what God is doing. I think for many of us, maybe we've lost the forest through the trees, and there's a great power in telling story, and in telling story about true story. And that's one of the things that I've enjoyed about your work, even with Tom Bombadil, talking about a fictional character, and yet at the same time using that to point toward something true and something lasting. Would you give a little introduction to that book, by the way, while we're at it? Because Lord of the Rings is not my expertise, and I'm going to confess before you today, I did watch the Rings of Power series, so that might have tainted my whole view on things. But
Yeah.
what was the impetus behind the book on Tom Bombadil?
Well, Tolkien was a world-class intellect, and he was a person who thought all the time about developments in the history of Western thought. His principal interest, the primary one, was language. Now, I think that when people hear that, they're maybe unable to see how that connects to other things. But I think recently, because of the desire to control speech, particularly by people on the left, folks are coming to see that language, understanding it Christianly, is really important, and that's what Tolkien was interested in. He was also interested in the relationship of truth and power, and one of the things that we see in kind of a materialist way of thinking about the world is that there's a great interest in power at the expense of truth. And what the Ring of Power in the Lord of the Rings is intended to be sort of a talisman of what that means. When truth is divorced from power, it becomes a temptation to aggrandize yourself and take upon yourself like a godlike status and try to sort of order the universe according to your own wisdom.
Right.
So that is at work now in the story. Tom Bombadil is the only character that is unintimidated by the ring. So if you read the books, if you're limited to what you know about the Lord of the Rings, because you've only seen the movies, you don't know who Tom Bombadil is.
Right.
Tom Bombadil, he's in 3 chapters in the early part of the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring. The chapters are The Old Forest and The House of Tom Bombadil and On the Barrow Downs. So those are the 3 chapters for Tom. but he's also referred to throughout the story at different points and at critical points. And what you see with Tom is someone who may actually be Sauron's match, because the ring has no power over him. He has power over the ring. I mean, we don't even see this with Gandalf or Saruman or any of the other important figures, Elrod, or anybody. Everybody, Galadriel, they're all intimidated by the ring because it's a real temptation to them, but it's not a temptation to Tom. So that was one of the things that compelled me to think about Tom, in sort of a sustained way, and to consider him as a very significant figure in the story and intended to communicate something to us. And when you know kind of the legendarium, the Silmarillion and the other books, when you've read Tolkien's letters to other people who ask questions about even Tom Bombadil, you get a sense of that Tolkien was up to an awful lot with Tom. He didn't divulge in any clear way what he was up to, but he said explicitly that Tom was important in one sense, but not in another, and that Tom was a comment, an important comment. And so, with those things in mind, I just spent a lot of time reflecting on Tom and knowing what Tolkien and Lewis, because I've got a background in philosophy. I knew the nature of the conversation that was kind of going on all the time with the Inklings. I knew enough about that to be able to point out some things in the story that I think people who don't have that background would miss. So that's what I did with Tom.
One of the things you pointed out, which I thought was so neat, was the effect or the use or the power of song.
Yeah,
because we speak of singing in church all the time. It's a way we tell stories, true stories of the faith. We confess true truths of the faith. And anybody that's read, when I read the books versus having seen the movies, there's a lot of differences, but one of the differences is like everybody's singing their way through everything in the books. There's a song in between almost every scene, and you see that with Tom. And I mean, you see this reflected. You mentioned the Inklings, and I'm thinking of Lewis's Magician's Nephew and the song that spins everything into existence. But it's a way of telling stories. It's focusing on that narrative arc. I don't know if I want to stretch that too far and say that that's eschatology in a nutshell, but it's at least connected, I would think, thematically.
Oh yeah, definitely. So the Inklings were influenced by Pythagoras, just like everybody in the history of Western thought was influenced by Pythagoras. So Pythagoras was a pre-Socratic philosopher who influenced Socrates, but his insight was there's a kind of mathematical character to reality. In other words, math corresponds to reality. This is the basis for all kinds of things, everything from physics to engineering. But Pythagoras was the first to see this. And he also noted that there's a relationship between mathematics and music. That was the thing that intrigued him. And that's just where we get the notion that there's a kind of music to creation, the music of the spheres. And the liberal arts, they're broken into two parts. There's the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium addresses human speech, and then the quadrivium addresses the language of creation. And there's actually a hierarchy in the quadrivium. You start with math, you move on to geometry, you move on from that to cosmology, and then from there you move on to music. So music is the highest expression of the mathematical arts. And so when Lewis and Tolkien, in both of their fictional worlds, the world is created with song. So you noted in The Magician's Nephew that Aslan sings Narnia into existence,
right?
But in the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, the opening of the Silmarillion is the singing into being of Arda, which is Middle Earth, by the Ainur, who are the Valar.
Wow.
So that actually means that Melkor and Gandalf and Sauron and all of those characters who were part of the Ainur, participated in the creation of the world.
See, you've now officially stepped past my knowledge, because I've never read the Silmarillion.
Yeah, well,
Familiar with it, but I've never went through it.
Yeah, I encourage you to read it. It has a different flavor than The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, because it's written in a very sort of majestic mode. It's intended to be epic in character.
Does it answer why the Eagles didn't take them straight to I'm sorry, I had to throw it in there. No.
It doesn't get into that, but
I love the it's an audio clip of Tolkien when he was asked that. I'm sure you've heard it from him at the bar, and he goes through, like, in that very slow speech, and he says, well, whenever I'm asked that question, I like to respond, shut up.
That's probably the best response.
That's right. Mr. Wiley, where can people follow you? I've mentioned they can keep up with you on the podcast, which is available on YouTube and podcasting networks. But where can they follow you? Where can they keep up with, especially with your writing and what your projects are currently?
Well, I've got an author website, like every writer does, and I never update it until there's like a book that I want to put on it. So that's you can follow me there, although you don't see much. It's crwiley.com. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm even on Instagram, but I just, those aren't places where I'm like posting things that have to do directly with my writing or anything. They're just sort of like places where I just like, share something that I thought was interesting or so forth. But you noted the podcast. That's probably the best place, kind of keep up to speed with what I'm up to, because the three of us are share regularly what we're doing.
Very good. Very good. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us, and just recommend again In the House of Tom Bombadil, but also The Household and the War for the Cosmos, just a foundational book. But CR Wiley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, Josh, it was great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Seated here at my right hand.